Well, let's get some analysis now on the comments by Solomon Islands Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare. Dr. Tess Newton Cain is project lead of the Pacific Hub at Griffith University's Asia Institute and joins me now from Brisbane. Tess Newton Cain, thank you so much for your time. This is quite the outburst from the Solomon Islands Prime Minister, saying he learnt through the media of the AUKUS arrangement that, quote, members of the Pacific should have been consulted to ensure this AUKUS Treaty is transparent, since it will affect the Pacific family by allowing nuclear submarines in Pacific waters.
Yeah, I mean, Prime Minister Sogavare is quite well known for his declamatory style when he's on his feet on the floor of Parliament. So we saw some very typical Sogavare rhetorical flourishes and, is a fair amount of parliamentary theatrics. But he did take I think it's interesting what he did point to. There's been a lot of external criticism about the transparency or lack of transparency around this agreement between Solomon Islands and China. And so it's not that surprising, do his own form of whataboutism or point to an agreement that, was equally lacking in transparency prior to it being announced. I think on the issue of transparency, the more significant question is the level of concern that we've heard expressed within Solomon Islands about the lack of transparency that's been there. So we've heard that from the opposition in Parliament, and we've heard that from civil society. Sogavare did address that as well, basically saying we govern by mandate, not consent. So it's not about, we have been given the mandate to make these decisions and take these policies forward by virtue of being elected in 2019.
Yeah, I want to come to some of that because Manasseh Sogavare went on to say the Solomon Islands did not become theatrical or hysterical, that they respected Australia's decision to sign up to AUKUS. So how much of this is an attack on Australia, or is it for a domestic audience in the Solomons?
I think it's a bit of both, as we would expect. I think, he did make some... he was fairly scathing about what he referred to as the Western media and the way that things had been portrayed. I think it does illustrate, and this isn't the first time we've heard Pacific politicians, we've heard it in Vanuatu, we've heard it in Papua New Guinea, concerns about how their countries and their leaders and the decisions that they make are portrayed in the Western media. And by that, they often mean the Australian media as well as other media. And I think it does speak to a point that I've discussed a couple of times this week about the type of terminology and language that's used when covering these stories and reflecting on these issues, and recognizing that, people in Solomon Islands, they have the internet, they can watch the news or read news online, and they take to heart how their countries are described and discussed.
Yeah, so how carefully does Australia need to navigate this space and watch the rhetoric then?
I think there needs to be a lot more care. I think we saw some quite significant shifts in rhetoric, particularly by Scott Morrison and Marise Payne, as we were going through the throes of this agreement being signed, and they were particularly careful to stop using or make sure they weren't using terms like our backyard. And I think Scott Morrison actually said they don't like it when we say that. We've yet to see that same level of care and self-awareness taken up by all of the commentariat. We heard, over the last little while, we've seen Solomon Islands referred to as a fly-speck country or a little Cuba. So this sort of language, this sort of rhetoric is not just offensive. It is offensive, but not only that, I think it can be counterproductive.
So just to flip it and to ask how this is being received in Australia in the middle of an election campaign, does this cut through as an election issue?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And obviously, the fact that we're having this conversation in the middle of an election campaign is something of a uncharted territory, because this is not normal for Australian elections. I think it would be a shame if it did become so politicised and was allowed to become an election issue without a proper discussion of the whole context. I think if it was just about this one event or this one critical juncture, whilst it would bring the Pacific or Solomon Islands relationship to the fore, it may not necessarily be what's needed in terms of proceeding forward with what is a long-standing and wide-ranging relationship that has many, many aspects to it over and above security.
Tess Newton Cain, thanks so much for your analysis.
Thanks, Karina.